is how to develop this openness with each other and explore. And the third is for those of you who are not married yet, that you're more prepared for this and maybe even some avenues to discover forgiveness and grace when you have not been. For God does forgive and he does renew and creates you new in Christ. And that's the good news. That's the power of the good news. You may have blown it in so many different ways, but God creates you brand new with a clean slate, and forgiveness is available. So I want to lay that out first, and I'd like to suggest that we begin this session as well with prayer, and then we're going to openly discuss some things about intimacy. Yes, sir. We have what now? We just now went live. So everything I just said is not true. Okay, so those of you who are online, just want you to know we're having a graphic discussion, but it'll be PG to R-rated discussion on sexual relations and marriage, and in many cases, how to relight the fire of passion in the bedroom. And so with that in mind, if you have kids in the room, just be aware that we're going to be dealing with issues that you may not want your children at this stage of their life and development to be dealing with or asking questions about. And others of you are very open to that and you don't mind. And it may be as well, this is a good thing. In my opinion, this is a good discussion for teenagers and above. Definitely college students, and whether you're married or not. So, let's pray. Lord, tonight as Dale and I wrap up our time in this particular workshop seminar, I pray that you'll grant wisdom and open hearts in us and in all who are listening, but most importantly, you would penetrate our hearts with your wisdom and with the foundation of your word and guidance, that we would understand and honor how you have created us. And you've created us as physical and sexual beings, and that is something we do not ignore, but rather do openly with each other, in the safety and the security of your body and in the word that you have provided in the Bible. And I pray that you will give us full grace, understanding, enlightenment, all that will help us in our relationships with each other, and also help us to walk in a pure and holy way as we honor you and we serve you and we love you. And we say these things all together in the name of Jesus. Amen. I want to tell you, I appreciate, I'm with you all the time, but I love that you all have chosen to be here tonight, this whole day, yesterday evening. It means a lot. But to have Dale come in, that also means a lot. And you've trusted me in saying how much he has to offer. And I hope you agree that there's been a lot of stuff that he's offered that's really, very valuable. And tonight we're talking about the sexual relationship. But before we get into that, I want to discuss with you some ideas about intimacy. When I say, when Jan and I were intimate with one another, what immediately comes to your mind? When Jan and I were intimate with each other. And I don't want you to get a picture here. I just want you to say, what comes to your mind? What am I talking about? Okay, sex, first thing that comes to mind. And that would be how we use the word intimacy. But are you aware there are at least 5 different kinds of intimacy? So you have physical intimacy. You have intellectual intimacy, because I'm a physical being. I live in a body. I'm an intellectual being. Some of you may question that, but I really am. And thirdly, if I'm an intellectual being, what else am I? Emotional. I'm an emotional being. And I'm also, with regard to you, we have a connection. I am a relational being. There's an intimacy within relational activities. And then there's what else am I besides intellectual, emotional? Starts with a sp and ends with an irritual. Okay, I'm a spiritual person, right? And so those are 5 different things that make me, me, that make you, you. And there are also 5 categories of intimacy. So, of course, there's a physical intimacy in every kind of relationship. Wait a minute. If it's only sexual, okay, who said it's only sexual? Intimacy is not only regarding sex. It is the process of touch and what's communicated in touch. So Caleb and I see each other and say, hey, man, how you doing? There's a touch involved. What does that communicate to him when I touch him? I say, hey, what's up, man? So I've tapped him and I've squeezed his shoulder a couple of times. What does that do? I have a movement to it. Now, I wouldn't do this with everyone, but why would I feel comfortable to do this with Caleb? There's a relationship that's built, and there's also a process. We've already shaken hands. We've already done the bro hug. We've already patted the back, walked by and said, hey, what's up, man? And there's a touch between guys in a way of expressing friendship that is a level of intimacy. So in a dating relationship, we also develop this intimacy with each other. And you know how that goes. You're young and you reach over and you touch the finger and the electricity, you're going wild inside. You say, oh, we just touched fingers. And then you hold hands. It's like touching the fingers, holding the pinkies don't carry with it the same electricity. So it's called the law of diminishing returns. As you're dating, you're progressing in that physical contact. And so that becomes a hand on a hand and an arm rubbing the hand or an arm and then the shoulder and then the touch. And then you move to touching each other in various ways. And the closer you get, the more you define the relationship in the dating way. In our culture, there are certain things that are permitted because you're dating, certain closeness that you have, that we say, okay, we're at this level of intimacy. I allow you this opportunity with my body, and we become more and more. What does that do? First of all, what's happening as it happens, and what does it do for the relationship or to the relationship, for the relationship and to the relationship? What's happening there, and how is it happening? Well, one of the things that's happening is I'm allowing myself to be somewhat explored. You're becoming vulnerable. You're opening yourself up. Now, when a couple is married, we're going to place now a sexual relationship and nudity with each other in the marriage context. Would you agree that's a biblical foundation, everyone? Or do we need to talk about that too? Are you with me on that? So what is the point or the actual ingredient of intimacy to that level? What's happening there? Well, I would make an argument that one of the foundational principles of intimacy is self-disclosure. Self-disclosure. Can you get any more self-disclosing with each other than completely naked in each other's presence and now uniting your bodies together? You're pretty open, aren't you? That's total self-disclosure. And you're also in a very vulnerable position. So those two go together, I think, as far as intimacy is concerned. Your willingness to disclose yourself to another and your willingness to be vulnerable with each other. And God has placed within the sanctity and the security of a covenant relationship of marriage for you to have that openness and security without the fear of being rejected. But within each of us, there's kind of a fear of rejection in that. Okay, pause just a moment. Intellectual intimacy. We're going to have a conversation. What's your major again? Nuclear engineering? Mechanical and nuclear. That explains the glow for Mike. As you look over, you see this radiance coming out, right? So when Micah and I talk, and I discuss some things about nuclear. That's mechanical and nuclear combined. Nuclear engineering. Mechanical engineering and nuclear engineering. Do I know much about this? I can't even pronounce the words. But if we have a discussion, and the more we talk, and he opens up to me things that he knows about it, and I open up to him what little I know about it, there's now a connection in that level. That connection is an unseen bond that develops because I've expressed interest in what he has in his knowledge. Got a friend who almost all of our conversation is about philosophy and something intellectual. So he is my intellectual friend. We have an intimacy in philosophy. And the more we talk, the more he discloses what is in him about philosophy. And the more I talk, the more I disclose things that I have about philosophy. And that creates and deepens the bond with each other. The more we give, the more deeper it is. You see the process. This is my theory, and you can do with it what you want, but I think it's how things work, and you can disagree with me. I think Dale does in some ways, but he's wrong about that and other things too. So, but I think if you disagree with me on this, that's okay. I want you to do your own thinking and come to my conclusions. So then we can have intimacy in other areas. So we have intimacy physically, we have intimacy in intellect, we have intimacy emotionally. Can you think of someone that you have shared an emotional experience with that because you both went through that together, it created a bond between you? I mean, a really unbreakable bond. There are some things that, I'm going to go back to Dale again. Dale and I have experienced some things together as both roommates and as just close friends. But when we were both teenagers, there was a young girl who died at 15 years old. And we were both friends with Andrea. And that rattled our world. And we walked through that together. The emotional experience created a deeper bond. Can you see that? So there are levels of emotion. You laugh together. Hey, how you doing? We joke with each other. And then I tell you something grieving that I've gone through or a difficult time that I've shared and what it does to me emotionally. And I've disclosed to you something. See, when I give myself disclosure, what am I actually offering? I'm giving myself, right? A piece of my heart. That's a great way to say it. I'm giving myself. And I'm offering you a present. Now, how are you going to respond to that as I give you this self-disclosure? If you accept it, that helps create an acceptance that I feel inside. And I feel like, wow, I feel closer to you because I told you this and you loved me anyway. Yeah, you didn't reject me and you didn't reject what I said. And that is so valuable. And so if I sit down and I say, I've had a real difficult time recently and this is some issues that I've got and I'm a failure here. And you say, I'm going to talk to the elders about that. I think they ought to get rid of you. Now, if that were to happen, would I feel a bond with her? No, because I've been rejected and she's going to get rid of me. So but if I were to say, hey, I've got this going on and here's where I failed. And she said, man, we need to pray. I understand what you're going through. In fact, something that I've gone through is somewhat similar to what you have. Now, she's offering her present to me. And when I offer the heart of who I am and issues of my emotion or my intellect, and I give you my self-disclosure, and you accept that in and of itself creates some dropping of chemicals from our brain to our body. What's it called? It's that oxytocin or something like that. Dopamine is one of them. But there's another chemical that, like when women have their babies and they're breastfeeding, it creates this drop of. Thank you, oxytocin. Good grief, how can I forget that? Oxytocin. Because I'm an oxymoron. Just take off the oxy. Oxytocin. I said it. So the creation of that bond is a chemical, emotional, intellectual process that is built upon self-disclosure more and more and mutual acceptance and safety that's provided with respect to the vulnerability that I feel. When I begin to open up to you and tell you some things that I've experienced or some things that I've done that I'm scared you're going to reject me when you find this out about me. And I don't find rejection. I find open-armed love and acceptance. That creates this bond of connection. Can you see how that works? So how about spiritual or relational? We're going to do some activities together. I had to get my friend back in Port Huron, Michigan, and he taught me how to play racquetball. And a lot of our time, if not most of our time, what happened here? And it was about racquetball. And he would be what I would call my racquetball friend. And that was the majority of the time we spent together. Then we got to get coffee and we'd have some intellectual and emotional discussions with each other, which deepened the relationship in the racquetball, and that deepened the relationship in the other ways. 5 kinds of intimacy, at least, and different levels of intimacy. So now you're dating and you're working with each other and building your relationship. How do you develop the spiritual intimacy? What are some things that you might do that would deepen and open spiritually? Well, if you openly discuss your personal beliefs about God, about what the Bible teaches, in a safe environment where you're discussing, not trying to build each other. I'm going to convince you, you're going to convince me, but rather we're going to work together and build this knowledge base together. You see how it builds intimacy. And I'm being open with you. This is what I believe about God. I don't see God that way. Was that a deal breaker? Not necessarily, because if you're both are going to work on mutual knowledge, or at least shared understanding, then I know this is where you're coming from, and you know this is where I'm coming from. Shared meaning does not mean we agree necessarily. It means we understand each other, even if we stay disagreeing with each other. So what would happen if a young couple were to decide every time we're together, we're going to pray together out loud? What would happen in their relationship? You think it would deepen their relationship or cause wedge in the relationship? It could, couldn't it? Okay, so that's an idea. You said, well, let's explore that. One night I prayed, and next night she prays, or I want to pray a little bit, and she prays a little bit, and I pray a little bit, and she prays a little bit. Or what that happens is when you're praying out loud about each other and about your lives and for each other, do you think that might deepen a feeling of connection and bondness and a closeness to a unity between the two? Why did God create the male and female marriage relationship, man and woman? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, join to his wife, and the two shall become one. I would argue that one of the primary, if not the primary, purpose of sexual relationship is to create a oneness between the two. The deepest form of intimacy is in the physical connected to the spiritual, united with the relational activities, buttressed by the intellectual and the emotional. And there is no other kind of relationship that has the depth of potential for intimacy as marriage is. And you also begin sharing that with your own children because they are a one product of the creative force of the two people. God is creator. He created you in his image. Guess what you did when you joined and you had a baby? You just participated in creating something new. There's a life where there was no life before. The creation took place. Just like Adam and Eve were created, so was that little baby. And so now together you've created this child. The oneness is expressed even more, and the bond is there because this is our baby. And as you keep building the intimacy, you can see the deepening of and the creation, the strength of the cables of intimacy strengthen, and that oneness deepens because you keep exploring spiritually together. Reading a book of devotion, taking time reading and discussing it openly might be a way, or something like it. Watching a church service somewhere happening sometime, and you're watching it together, and then you talk about it. Would you agree with that? What'd that do for you? What was the point you agree? Oh, I didn't notice that at all. Thanks for pointing that out. And you're helping each other. But what is your goal ultimately with your spouse? Isn't it to help him or her become closer to the reflection of Jesus? I want her to know Jesus more. I want him to have such an intimate relationship, because you know what the Bible talks about, the most intimate relationship you can possibly have is with Jesus himself. It's in that context that Paul says if you have sex with a prostitute, what happens? You become one flesh. That's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you become one flesh. And then he says that's not what ought to be happening, because that's reserved for marriage. But I'm telling you, we have become one spirit with the Lord. That is a supernatural, spiritual event of a union with Jesus to such a degree that Paul says the physical realm is really a shadow or a reflection of what's happening spiritually. You're one In fact, marriage, husband and wife, husbands love your wives, church wife, respect your husband like the church does Jesus. He says, this is a mystery, but I'm really talking about Christ and the church. So physical marriage is a reflection or a mirror or a light that shines that says, this is what we're showing you on earth, what spiritually is happening with the church and Jesus. Does that add a new dimension or a different dimension or at least a different insight as to what your marriage really is and what your family is all about? A reflection of Jesus and his church? And what does that do for you as you recognize this is a point of intimacy? So what happens there were times when Jan and I prayed together and their bond of intimacy felt deeper than when we had sexual relations with each other. When I heard her pray for me, it did stuff for me and connected us in ways that the physical were just a great expression of what I just experienced spiritually with her. I'm just inviting you to consider that that's one way to help build your intimacy with each other. But would you see that there are 5 different kinds of intimacy? We were talking about conflict and conflict management. And I'm about to hand over the baton to Dale and let him take this over. But I want you to hear what one of the students I had in class, I was teaching conflict management at Boise State University. It's like a 400 level course. And I was in way over my head to begin with because I'm not a great conflict manager, but I was teaching the material out of a book, so I felt comfortable. I'm teaching conflict management. We were talking about different ways of dealing with conflict. And one of the women up front, return student, she's in her 40s or 50s, and she said, you know what my husband and I do when we have conflict? Have I told you this before? It's hilarious. I said, no, what? And she said, well, we decided that anytime we have serious conflict with each other, we were going to strip naked and then have our conflict. It never ended out negative. I thought, okay, that's an interesting way to choose to deal with conflict. Another couple, when Dale and I were doing this particular seminar like this in Boise, Idaho, there was a couple that raised their hand. He was a county sheriff, and she worked with, I think, Human Services Department, and they had 2 children. And she says, sometimes we'll get into a really violent conflict with each other, and one of us will say, stop, wait, let's write down what we think this conflict is about. So they both take a minute, and they're both writing down, and then they exchange what they wrote. And they said nearly every time it ended up in great laughter because they did not agree. They were arguing past each other because they were both arguing about something that was not. They didn't even know what the other person was saying, but they were hearing the words and applying it to what they thought. So this idea that Dale had with the couple and said, "No, I want you to type it out." I couldn't help but think about that couple that we were listening to. Maybe you remember them, but it's just a great illustration that sometimes it's good to say, wait a minute, what are we really discussing here? And argue. And it comes about, maybe something's not even worth arguing. You find that out when you do it naked. So that's a great transition into Dale's discussion with us about sex therapy and sexual relationship, part of the relationship. How do you renew, or how do you keep building the fire, the passion? And can it happen when you're past your 50th anniversary or 70th anniversary? And I remember a book on my father-in-law's shelf. He taught Bible for 50 years academically. And there's a book on his shelf, and the title was Sex After 50. And I was intrigued by that title, but never read the book. Now we have an expert, and I'm going to turn it over to Dale and let him address these issues. You want to address anything I've said or disagree with it, go at it, man. And then I'll join in whenever you're open to me coming back. Now I'm on.
There we go.
Should be.
Thank you. Now it's working, so good for that.
I used to say, you got to be smarter than the device.
And and I would acknowledge that it's true. The device is more. I believe that's mine, Kevin. Thanks. Okay, thanks. All right, so I really liked what Kevin said. It was a good introduction to this, and I'll talk about intimacy in a few minutes in a different way than he did, but it's not a contradiction. It's just another way to think about what happens in the bedroom. So, first of all, let me tell you what I think about sex, which I could take hours talking about that, but I'll just say a few things in the beginning, just so you kind of know where I'm coming from. I don't believe, and Kevin said it might get R-rated, so here it goes. I don't believe that vaginal intercourse necessarily is the um, the goal or the thing that people definitely are shooting for in order to have a good relationship. Now, why did I talk about it like that? Because if I talked about it like that and you didn't know who I was, you might say, how old are you? How much experience do you have? Because I talked about it maybe like a 15-year-old would talk about it, but as a 66-year-old who's been working with couples in one capacity or another for a number of years and have done lots of training in sex therapy, worked with a lot of couples around sex, I come back to that over and over again without ever really saying that. And I'm just going to say a couple things up front, and then I'm going to just kind of put them there, and then we're going to come wrap back around. So in some ways it's confusing because I'm starting with this up front just to pique your interest, and then we'll come back around to it later. So here's why I'm saying that, because couples come in to see me, and they've had non-satisfactory sexual relations forever. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and the conversation usually is about what happens in vaginal intercourse or not having vaginal intercourse. So the whole conversation is, and I apologize if this is too raw for some people, the whole conversation is about putting a penis into a vagina and having that to be a pleasant experience, and that both people have an experience of release at the same time that's satisfying. Do you know that almost never happens for people? And if that happens to you and your partner regularly, I would ask you to raise your hand, but I wouldn't, because everybody else here would be jealous of you, because that's not a typical human experience. It's not a typical human experience. So people feel like failures. People feel like, what am I doing wrong? People have all kinds of stories they tell themselves. But let's look at some other things before we even get there. Let's look at sexuality in marriage and how it was discussed throughout the years. You can look now, 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010, currently. There's books in the Christian literature that supports Christian couples in intimacy. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, some of it's really good, but then I'm thinking about a particular book. I'm not going to tell you what it is, because every time I say it, some people come up and say, that book helped us, and we, we had a better marriage after we read it, and they probably did. But, I thought the author in some ways went to male humor in ways that I didn't find real respectful and really childish. And when I had students read it and critiqued it, did book reports on it, almost all the students talked about, hey, this was good until we got to the end and the humor was bad and, it was kind of off-putting. And it probably was. And again, it was. But what am I saying is that a lot of us had parents and grandparents that lived in a world where we didn't talk about sex, where we talked about it. Did any of you grow up in houses where if a cousin or a neighbor or someone became pregnant outside of wedlock, they would say something like, she got in trouble. Did you ever have that? She got in trouble, and or something like that, or she's pregnant, and it was like this taboo that people didn't talk about, and people would naively make mistakes. I have talked to 7 different people in my lifetime who males who were in high school and they wanted to have sex with their girlfriend and they didn't have a condom and they didn't know how to use one. So the 7 of them had the same story. Some of them said that's when we got pregnant. Some of them said I don't know how we didn't get pregnant, but they used a baggie. I kid you not, a baggie and a rubber band. You know how long that lasts? I'll give you maybe a second of protection, so or not say protection, and it's just. But you ask, how does that happen? And people don't understand their bodies. How does that happen? Because this whole thing was shrouded in shame and quietness forever. So one of my favorite people, she's not a Christian person, but she's one of my favorite people to talk about this kind of thing for years, was a woman named Emily Mudd from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Anybody ever hear of Emily Mudd? You ought to read about Emily Mudd if you ever can. She was a great lady, born in 1898, died in 1998, one day short of her 100th birthday. She lived 99 years and 364 days. But I would have loved to have met that woman, and I've been to a place in Philadelphia doing some consulting where they carry on her work. It's called the Council for Relationships, and they have an Emily Mudd library and all of her stuff and pictures of her, and the pictures is what got me about her. Because you know what's happened in Philadelphia is really different then than it is now. You couldn't pass out information on birth control or anything related to birth control in the 1930s. So Emily Mudd was pregnant. She was very noticeable, about 8 months pregnant, and you also couldn't really arrest a person that was 8 months pregnant. You couldn't put them in jail. So Emily Mudd took advantage of this and was in downtown Philadelphia passing out information on sex and birth control and condoms, and they couldn't arrest her. You can see why I like this lady, right? And so she wrote a whole lot about sexuality and about female sexuality in particular, and I think she did a good job, kind of taking the thing off. I have an older friend that grew up in Bloomington, Indiana, where Kinsey was, because some of you know about the Kinsey reports. You've probably seen the Kinsey movies. That comes along, and Kinsey comes along, and he's doing the surveys, finding out about human sexuality. And this guy says, he wasn't a kid, he was in his 70s when I talked to him. He says, I asked him, well, you've been about the same age as the Kinsey kids would have been. He goes, yeah, I grew up with them, and I wasn't allowed to play with them. He said, I always felt bad for the Kinsey kids because nobody would let their kids play with the Kinsey kids. It was a different era. Why am I telling you this? Because sex has been shrouded in mystery. It's been something we don't talk about, or we talk about around the margins, instead of speaking about it very specifically. Well, I'd like to speak about it very specifically tonight, and I'm not going to give you just a history lesson like that, and I only said that to kind of highlight how it's not been that long ago that it was something that was shrouded in so much mystery and a taboo that we didn't talk about it. I'd like, though, to begin to, and then we'll talk about what to do about it, but to maybe talk about where some people here may be setting in their relationship with sex. Notice I didn't say their relationship with their partner, but their relationship with sex, an idea of sex. I had a couple I saw one time that were about 60 years old. And I asked them why they came in, and they said they wanted to see a Christian therapist that would help them and would understand them because they had talked to their minister, and their minister had given them a book to make things more creative, but they said they were bored with sex. They'd been married, I don't know how many years, but for sure, I think it was about 50. I say 50, but I'm not sure if it's 50, but I'll say 50 just for sake of argument. It's close to that. So like 40 of those years, they'd been bored with sex. Tell me a little more about being bored with sex. We do it the biblical way. What's the biblical way, I say? Good question, right? Well, the way that God intended it, he's on top and I'm on bottom, the wife said, and we wouldn't think about doing it any other way. So I said, okay. So I'm thinking, yeah, they're bored. They've done things in the same way for 50 years. If I was eating the same meal, for 50 years, I wouldn't like to eat that meal. I probably would be bored too. So tell me about your creativity in foreplay. And he says, what's foreplay? Okay. And I looked at her and said, well, can you tell me about that? And she goes, yeah, I know a little bit about that. That's that stuff you do before you do it. And I said, yeah, well, we kind of get down to business, she said. And she says, he kisses me, I kiss him. He touches my breast, I touch him down there. She wouldn't say the words. I touch him down there, and shortly he puts it in me. Okay, so tell me about that experience. I never have wanted to hurt his feelings, but it's always hurt when he's done that. Okay, and so I asked him, so when you touch her breast, do you ever touch her down there? And I use that term because I know where they're at. And he says, I have on a couple times. What's that like? And he says, well, I don't know. I touched it. I'd asked a few other questions. I said, well, I got to ask the question more specifically. Is it wet or is it dry? And here's the kicker. 50 years. It's dry, of course. I kid you not. And I'm like thinking, that poor woman, at that point, 50 years, that poor woman. So I just kind of step back and get my breath and talk to them. And so I say, well, we're not even going to talk about being bored with sexual intercourse. And both of them went, because it was a word they didn't want to hear. It was a word that was uncomfortable for them. I said, you want to be a little more imaginative, and you only can find this position that you think is a biblical position. I don't know where they got that, but the biblical position, they said. And so I said, let's look at what happens beforehand. So I said, hey, and I made it really easy for them because they were uptight and they were folks that wouldn't want to talk about it. So what would just kiss a little longer if you do anything else. And then, I asked him to be more imaginative and exploring her. And I said, explore her breast like you've been exploring her breast. And I said to him, explore his body in the way you've been exploring it, but maybe explore in some different ways. And I gave some suggestions. A couple of them said, and then I just said, what would you be comfortable with? And they told me what they would be comfortable with. And what that's like if you're in relationships. People are so comfortable with some touch, not other touch, and reluctant to do some things. And so they both began talking about what they'd be comfortable with and not comfortable with. And that was a safe conversation for them. Why was that a safe conversation for them? Because it wasn't about this thing called vaginal intercourse that gets everybody uptight, that everybody's interested in. We were talking about what happened before that. And so I just said, let's just do this for a couple of weeks. Don't even think about, don't even think about altering how you're having intercourse. Every time I said a word, she went, But I said, don't even think about that. And maybe you don't even need to do that now. And at that point, I think instead of her going, and I may have imagined, but I think she said, whew. at that point, because she's going to get a respite from a painful experience. It's going to be a very painful experience. So I said, just explore. And so they came back every week, and a couple weeks later, I just said to them, how's your exploration going? They said, well, we messed up. And they both grinned, and I said, how'd messed up? They said, well, we did that thing, and I, being the honorary therapist I am, I said, what's that thing? I don't know what you're talking about. You know, that thing that we're in here about. Oh, okay, I didn't get them saying more, but I said, okay, they did that thing. And so, was it better? And she said, it didn't hurt this time. Why didn't it hurt this time? Everybody here knows why it didn't hurt this time, right? Because, she was lubricated, she was moist, and the experience was better. But then we kept talking about, okay, well, let's just keep working on what happens before you do that thing. I decided just to start calling it do that thing because they were comfortable with that. Before you do that thing, that'd make a great song, wouldn't it? That song lyrics. But before you do that thing, let's work on you exploring your bodies in ways that are very satisfying. And over time, things got better because they insisted on doing it in the biblical way. And I didn't think I was going to get away with this. I waited until they were far enough along that I thought if they fire me and never come back, then, things are, better, and maybe they go to somebody else and at this point and finish up. I thought it was a point where I could risk it. I said, well, therapists don't always tell the truth all the way, and sometimes, I'll be honest with you, it's part of what we do because we got to get people to do what they want to do. Because I don't think there's biblically sanctioned ways to do this and not do this, but I wasn't going to tell them that because they'd walked out the door right then, And so I said, I'm wondering if you configure it with the man on top as the biblically sanctioned way, you've been in this for 50 years, if God would mind to see if you could do it in the biblically sanctioned way upside down. And they had to pray about that one. They had to pray about that one. So they did it in the biblically sanctioned way upside down, and they came back and said, wow, that was funny. Do you think there was fun? They said, do you think there's other biblically sanctioned modifications that we could make? So I started imagining with them the biblically sanctioned modifications they could make. And, and I just asked them, we talked about it, showed it to them, and it worked out really well. There's the Kama Sutra is an ancient, I believe it's Hindu thing, and there used to be, it's not there anymore, there's one that's kind of crude now, but there used to be something that we used in sex therapy for people like them that was animated. I mean, it wasn't vulgar at all. You would see like silhouettes, but you could see it well enough to get the picture. And so I said, would you mind seeing this if it wasn't pornographic? And I said, if you think it's pornographic, then I'm not going to show it to you anymore. So I pulled it up on my computer, and they were like, wow, yeah, I get the idea. So I said, here it is. I gave them the link, mailed them the link, and said, why don't you all look at that together and see what you think's biblically sanctioned and not biblically sanctioned? And to cut to the chase on it, I was amazed that when they did their research, how many ways that God would think that, that you could do this in a biblically sanctioned way. I talked their language and got them to open up. And, I've always been grateful that they came in. I was grateful for them taking the risk. I was grateful that they talked about their worldview. And I was very, very grateful that they were able to open up just a little bit to try something different. Because that's a key as we get into this. Trying something different doesn't always have to be a big difference. One thing leads to the other, and I know that's a cliche when we're talking about sex, but it truly does. So I know that many people, when they've been married for a while, they do things in predictable ways at predictable times, and and it's very choreographed, same conversation, same foreplay, same positions, same conversation, lack of conversation afterwards, same nights. It becomes very predictable. And it's amazing when you do just one thing differently that you can agree on, how it begins to introduce novelty. And novelty is your friend when you're thinking about sexuality. But it has to be novelty that both of you want to do. Had a couple one time that they wanted, one of them wanted more novelty than the other did. And, they were married so they could do what they wanted to do. But, and I'm not going to use the proper terms for this because it would probably offend some people and some people would imagine it to be more than it was. But one of them wanted to be, it was the woman, she wanted to be tied up and she wanted, some bondage type stuff to happen because that aroused her. She'd been in former relationships before and had been a part of it. And he was like, no way am I going to do that. And we talked about it, and he said, and he had a history, because we all bring histories in. He says, this is not my first, I can remember saying it's second, third, fourth, fifth, 10th, 15th, 20th sexual partner. I was very active sexually before I got married. But one of the things that I know is that when the relationship goes bad, people oftentimes spin things or say things in the way they want to do. And this just seems like a bad trap, if we get divorced. And that's what he was saying. And he just said, I just don't want to do this because I know how the story could be spun. Makes sense. And so that's not, and she was really, really uptight about it. And he just wasn't going to do it. And so I said, and I think this is true for everybody, maybe not to the extreme they were at, she, wanted these things. It just wasn't going to be in his wheelhouse. He would never do them. So I said, have you ever done this? No. Tell me about your history. Well, we've been married for 6 months, year, 2 years, whatever it was, and we lived together a number of years before that. Well, you married this person you'd live with, and you never did that. Were there things you liked that he did? Yes, there were things. Tell me about it. So she began to tell me, and I asked him, was it satisfying? And he said, yeah, just about everything we do is satisfying, but the thing is, it's not what we do, it's what we don't do, because she wants to do this, and I don't want to do it, and it's become this big thing. And so we talked about this and more and more, and I just said, so let me get this straight. Things are good between you. You're playful. You explore new things. You generally tell each other what you like and you don't like. Yes, 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 yes. And ma'am, and she'd said this, you've enjoyed sex with him. You felt closer to him than anyone else you've been with. And you're thinking about in the relationship because of what he won't do. And it just stopped her. Because it jarred her, because all of a sudden she saw the reality. I'm in this relationship with this person that loves me and gets me. He's being upfront and saying, no, I don't want to do this. And he's saying why he doesn't want to do this. And the more I coerce him, the worse it's getting. So what happens if we shelve this and look at all of this? And she's the one that said it, and I only saw him a couple more weeks, and then a follow-up like 6 weeks later after that, and things were going fine because in many ways, problem was solved. Now, I gave an extreme case because I want to ask you something that I don't want anybody to shake their heads yes or no or to raise their hands because this is really, really personal. Just shake your head or think about it in here, in your head. Do you have fights in your relationship about things that one of you want to do sexually that the other one doesn't do? And if that was tabled, you would have a wonderful sexual relationship. or at least a satisfying sexual relationship. Because that one thing, or those two things, are getting in the way. Had a couple one time, and I just it just amazed me, how sometimes people reach their own epiphanies. We were having a conversation, just like this other couple I was talking about, and one of the partners really enjoyed anal sex, and the other one didn't enjoy anal sex, and the one that had enjoyed it in previous relationships, wanted it, and the partner, he'd given it to her, and he just said, I really don't find this satisfying at all. He said, I don't find it satisfying. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you, and talked about physiological things, which, can happen with that. He just was just saying, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. And she was like saying, if you love me, you'll do this. And he was saying, if you love me, you wouldn't keep asking me to do something that I don't want to do. And so it's kind of, this really ties into what we've talked about earlier, right? In terms of how people fight about defining the nature of the relationship, and pursuer, distancer, nag, withdrawal, all of that all plays out in this couple's relationship. And so finally, I just asked her, so if he gives you the anal sex that you're wanting, and you know that he finds it not satisfying, he finds it to be a real turnoff, and he feels really, really bad about himself and really about the relationship after he does that, what does that say? Well, what do you do? When you think about that? And she just looked at me and says, I never think about that. I've never thought about that. And so I did something that some people think is unethical, and I'm sorry that this is being videotaped and saying this, but I don't think it is. I said, well, next time you ask him to do that, and if he does do it, which I know he probably would, but I said, and if you're inclined to do it, I want you to think about that during that act, what it means to him. And I came back and said, well, what happened? Did you have anal intercourse this week or not? Nope, we didn't have anal intercourse. Why? And she said, every time I wanted to ask him, I thought about the things you talked about, and it just kind of ruined it. And I said, again, we're not always honest. They're fully honest in my profession. I said, I'm so sorry that I messed that up for you. I wasn't sorry. I wasn't sorry at all. And so things became much better for them. Now, I'll talk about some things. I've got one more case study, then I'm going to just get real practical with some things. Before that, but before I do the case study, I want to talk about two things. I'm going to borrow your Bible again for a different reason, if you don't mind, the Maroon Bible in a moment. But the first thing I want to talk about is shame. And I think one of the biggest problems that Christian couples have sexually is a sense of shame. My colleague Jamie Goff, that I taught with at Abilene Christian University when I was there, wrote a paper, a journal article she published from research she did on young Christian wives' shame about sexuality and their sexual past. I was at the CAPS conference in Columbus, Ohio about 3 weeks ago, and was looking at the poster presentations there, and someone from, I believe, Biola University, it may have been Wheaton College, one of those places, had a poster on research they were doing with male shame in Christian marriage. It was the same thing. A lot of people have done female shame, not as many people have done male shame. And I was glad to see that, because I think this sense of shame is there for both females and males. It's just something that seems to be pervasive oftentimes in Christian marriage. And I will tell you how I think it happens. You can disagree, and I hope that you disagree because this was not your experience in youth groups growing up or in young adult groups. But here's how it happens. We're afraid someone's going to get pregnant or get someone else pregnant. That's really, I think, the driving force a lot of times in youth group activities. I'm an elder at our church, and we were interviewing somebody for youth ministry thing a couple of weeks ago, talking to him, and he looked at us and said, well, I think kids are different now than they were when you were teenagers. And I said, yeah, I think so. Some things changed, but some things are the same. And he looked at us and said, what did you all talk about during your youth group? And I knew he thought that we would just have had like Bible study and those kind of things, talked about doctrine. And one of the other elders just looked at the other two of us and said, we talked about not smoking dope and not having sex. Over and over again, there's those two things. Don't smoke dope, don't have sex. Remember those days? We were in some of those conversations in youth groups as well. Don't smoke dope, don't have sex. And then they get in college groups, college campuses, and what do they often hear? A more sophisticated version of don't have sex until you're married. So then all of a sudden they walk down an aisle, they go through the ceremony, and what happens is, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, I hope this is nobody's situation here, that some people look at their past and they have shame because they walked down the aisle and they had sexual partners before. I wish I would have saved myself for marriage. And other people walk down the aisle and they haven't had sexual partners before, and they have shame because one of the reasons they hadn't had sexual partners before is because sex was such a taboo for them, such a thing. And I think that I'm not for sex outside of marriage. Let me just say that. But one of the reasons they okay pure is such a taboo that they just don't flip a switch and things are fine once they are married. I mean, that happens to a lot of people. I know that happens to a lot of people. They just don't flip a switch, and so there's shame. There's shame, and Kevin talked about being naked, being intimate, but there's sometimes shame in being naked in front of a partner. Sometimes body image stuff. I don't know. I think one of the worst things that has happened, apologize to anybody that does this kind of work because I know we make money from it, but we air blow people, not just in pornographic magazines, but other things. We air blow people, we make people look really well, and you look and you don't look like the people in the magazines. My colleague and friend Stephen Madigan, I went to a doctoral program with him. He lives up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and a number of years ago, you may even recall the story because it was on American TV and it was featured in Newsweek or Time in the early 2000s, late 90s, somewhere in there. He did a thing in Canada called the Anti-Anorexia, Anti-Bulimia League, where people that had fought bulimia and anorexia were protesting women's, the way the media portrayed women's bodies. And they did some weird stuff, I thought, but it was really successful. Like they got on billboards in Canada and things like that. And part of the result was, if you've ever seen an Ivory soap commercial, that company said, you're right. And so they had commercials of people that looked more like us. So people end up having this sense of shame sometimes because they look in the mirror and say, I don't look like that. And sometimes people have a sense of shame because of things their partners say about them. Sometimes people have a sense of shame because they wake up in the morning and their breath smells bad or other things, smell bad, and there's a sense of shame there. People often live in shame, and I say in kind of a snarky way, and that's a shame that people live in shame. And so we'll talk a bit more about that. People sometimes live in guilt because of things they've done or things they've thought about doing, not understanding the grace of God, not understanding forgiveness. And these things are barriers to intimacy. So, let me come back to the couple I spoke about. It was either this morning or last night, I can't remember, the couple where the man had been a virgin and he married the woman who had been date raped. This is the only time she'd had sexual activities when she'd been date raped, and her situation was handled disgracefully by the adults in her life. And I worked with them, as I mentioned, for 2.5 years. It was an interesting journey in the couple work. And I took that work and I've used it with couples since then, because I kind of had to invent it on the fly to work with them. I tailored it. I always tailor what I do to the people in front of me. And I take what I did with them and I often tailor it to the couple in front of me with the needs they have or the things they want to work with me on and accomplish. But I'll tell you a little bit about what I did with them, because he was badgering her to have sex. If you remember, he was the guy that said, I've been a virgin, God's going to bless me with a beautiful wife, and he did. And I'll be able to have sexual activity, be free in it, and it's going to be wonderful, we'll be blessed. And he married a woman that just couldn't do it. She would have flashbacks to the rape that she experienced. So, and again, when I'm talking about this, I'm not taking away from what Kevin said. It's just a different way of language. And actually what Kevin says was talking about it's more broad than this. I'm pretty much talking about aspects of a sexual relationship. So I asked them I put a constraint on him, and I remember him being really snarky about saying, why am I paying you to tell me this? It's been all these years. I said, well, I don't want you to have sex for at least 8 weeks. Probably shouldn't have said that. I'm surprised he ever came back. I'm surprised he wrote me a check. And after that, I said that because that's what I was after. But, man, she was relieved. I think she would have, probably doubled my my fee, for doing that. But it relieved her. And then I said, well, wait. I said, here's what I want you to do. I said, because we want to build a foundation for this. I said, my hunch is there's a lot of non-sexual intimacy here, but I really want you to explore and appreciate before we tackle this difficulty what non-sexual intimacy looks like. So we spent about 8 weeks looking at non-sexual intimacy. They come, they talk about it, things they found intimate, like getting a cup of coffee together, walking through the mall together, reading books. They like to read books, the same novel at the same time differently and talk about it. Bible study together, prayer together. That was their big non-sexual intimacy thing, and we did that for 8 weeks. Truth is, I didn't need to talk to them about that for 8 weeks, but I wanted to go really, really slow with them because I was working with her as well around her trauma, which nobody had ever worked with her around her trauma until that point. I was working with him around things, his disappointment, his bitterness, and trying to get him to do, to see some things differently, and just making progress. And then I said, this is very colloquial. You'll never find this in any publications. In fact, I thought about writing it up, but I said nobody will publish it because it would seem too colloquial, too common. But I think I love using this with couples I work with, and I'll share it with you. I said, all right, now I want you to work on non-sexual sexual intimacy. Non-sexual sexual intimacy. I said there's going to be 2 parts of this. The first is just exploring what you enjoy when you hold hands, because they would hold hands, when you hold hands and when you're both feeling comfortable to kiss, because a lot of times she didn't want to kiss because that would lead to him thinking, okay, she's ready for sex. I mean, it was just, he would sabotage himself with her things. And so I said, let's work on this. And we did this for a good amount of time. Looking at them kissing, holding each other, various things. They did some stuff that I thought was different that they talked about, that they found in discovering is that they like to blow very lightly on their bodies, around their neck and their head and even their face area. And I thought that was interesting. But, I praised it. I thought it was interesting, creative, and we had them do that. And then I said, at some point in the next few weeks, and you'll know when it's going to be, I want you to go to part B of non-sexual intercourse, sexual intimacy. You see how I'm talking about it, So no, that, and I said, I want you to explore your bodies a bit more, because he was like the expert on erogenous zones because he had all the literature on it, and he was saying, see, I told you and she needs to let me touch her here. I mean, he was just sabotaging everything. You wouldn't believe it if you see it. And and this should work when I do it. It was almost like she was a machine, his thinking. If I touch her this way, then she's going to be aroused. And I'm like thinking, wow, I can only imagine. I was thinking, this woman has these issues. And I've seen men like you, sir, with wives that don't have these issues. That if you weren't doing this, it'd be a wonderful experience. But he was treating her like she was a machine on top of it. And I said, if I can say this to you without being offensive, I think you're treating your wife like a machine, and bodies don't work like that. And this stuff's written really generally, and I gave some examples from things I'd read from student papers because I'd have people just anonymously talk about that stuff. When I used to teach a sex therapy class, they would type it, and then they would hand it in a manila envelope, and I would check that it was done. Then I would, put them all together so I would know whose was whose, to keep it that way. And I knew some of that had been a thing with some of them as well. So I knew that I had to get him to where he could just be more playful and exploratory. And as I mentioned, I got lost when I said that some of them found some ways of touch erotic that didn't fit with the literature. And they're saying, these are what, say the erogenous zones. When I get touched here, I don't like it. And they have partners that say, well, see, the literature says you should like that. What's wrong with you? You don't like it. Well, nothing's wrong with them. Everybody's body's made different. Everybody has different proclivities, right? People have different things they like and they don't like. And, one of them had talked about one time about that's a part of their body that nobody would think would be arousing. I can't remember what it was. They found arousing and something they did. Okay. So I shared that with him in general about my student papers, and I said, I want you to really, truly get to know your wife's body. Now, listen to the two things I'm saying, because I don't think any of us here have the issues they had, but I think this is true for everybody, almost everybody. I don't think anything's true for everybody, but for almost everybody. I said, I want you to do it in a curious way and a giving way. I want you to think about her needs. Because I don't think this gentleman in his stuff had thought about it so much. Be curious in terms of what she likes and don't like. Ask her if she's doing it, and do it in a giving way. And I asked her to do the same thing. And they did that for a few weeks, and she wasn't having flashbacks at all. Because it was a safe thing, it was a different thing, and they really, really enjoyed that. And then I asked her, I said, okay, we're getting ready to move, whenever you're comfortable, to trying sexual intimacy, to trying that in ways that you like. What are your ideas about this? It was really important to get her ideas, was it not? Because what you had, what would be safe for you? And she said, well, I've thought about it, and I think, if he would give me oral sex, I would like that, and it would be safe because, when he penetrates, or tried to penetrate that one time, and other times when he's started and I disassociate and have the flashbacks, it's because of that. So this would be something I might find pleasurable, but I wouldn't have the flashbacks. Okay. So so he tries it and she enjoys it, and and she does the same thing for him. He's a bit more satisfied, but then he messes it up. He gets pushy. And that happens a lot in relationships, does it not? He got aroused, he got pushy, and so there was a bit of a setback, but not much because talked about, okay, so what can you do? How can you talk about this? I think it's important for couples to talk. I talked about the one person they kind of like the bondage stuff earlier. Wouldn't use the word there, but people that do that, people that do any types of kink, that they're in the kink community, etc., they usually have a password or a code word to say, I don't like this isn't safe, this isn't fun anymore. And so I asked this couple, I said, do you know about that stuff? And they both said, yeah, we know about that. Both of them knew people who were, and I said, do you know about the code words and the passwords? They said, yeah. And we've talked about it. We're glad we don't have to do it. And I said, well, guess what I'm going to ask you to do? And they laughed and they said, okay, yeah, to have a password or code word. And so they had a code word. By the way, I can't get this out of my mind. I shouldn't tell you all about this, but my wife and I were watching something the other day. I don't know if it was on YouTube or on TV, where someone said that they were into that, and their password was meatloaf. Did y'all know about this? Meatloaf. I said, oh, what? I'm thinking about the food meatloaf. And they said, no, I know what you're thinking about. The food says the singer. And what it means is the lyrics from the song, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that. And I said, okay, what a creative word, meatloaf. And apparently that couple both like that. I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that. Cool. But for this couple, they had another word, and they kept exploring. And eventually what happened, I won't go through all of it, but they had what the late David Snarch called eyes open sex. And I asked her to do that, and you all may think that's crazy, that she disassociated, but she was thinking about somebody else. I said, I want you to look him in the eye, I want you to look her in the eye, and I want you to say, I'm your name, my name, and I want you to say to him, what his name was. And it worked. And they began to have an enjoyable sex life. And as I mentioned, they eventually had children, and I got pictures, 3 children, of those children. Why do I tell you that? Because the old people used to say, love will always find a way. And my work as doing sex therapy has convinced me that love can always find a way. So, I'll get really raw about it again in some ways. Some of my work with couples has really, really helped me appreciate this. I have worked with couples where one of them has been paralyzed and they only have feeling in their body from here up. And we've worked with them to find ways that both of them can have pleasure. Love can find a way. In fact, I have a colleague that was my former student at University of Louisville that went to University of Georgia to do her doctorate, and she's written lots of stuff on doing sexual work with people who have paralysis. That's kind of her area. And it's amazing when I sat and talked to her about the work she's done with these couples to think, what a gift to these couples. And she says the same thing I've been saying tonight. The first thing you have to do is to convince them that it's not just about vaginal intercourse. And they find ways to be happy. I've worked with people where, for whatever reason, and there's a lot of reasons, diabetes, other diseases, medications, where a man can't achieve an erection or can't sustain an erection, and they've found ways to have very happy sex lives by talking and being creative and looking what they can do manually with each other. Because when you really lean into foreplay and then you lean into what really feels good, it can be very happy. But I say all that to come to the more the thing that nobody talks about in the church. Very few people talk about it outside of the church because I think it's a truth that we don't really want to talk about. But the research literature supports this true that oftentimes males climax before females do. Oftentimes males ejaculate and the female partner still hasn't had her needs met. I'm going to say something that's going to seem overly simple, but it's not, because everybody has the nuances of their own relationship and what that means. For some people, like, okay, this is a failure, but it's probably going to be a failure that happens over and over and over again. But if we, commit that to this idea that having vaginal intercourse, where both people, climax at roughly the same time, is something's going to happen, and so that's likely not going to happen all the time or that often. The question becomes, I'm going to say the male partner, but sometimes it's the female partner as well. It's usually the male partner climax first and has to help the female partner, but sometimes it's the other way. So what's so wrong, what's so bad about continuing to help your partner along the way? Helping to manually, digitally stimulate your partner until your partner achieves what she, her satisfaction. That has just been a constant theme in my work with people, and I almost hate to take money from people, to talk about it, because the solution is, again, pretty simple, but the implementation is pretty hard because oftentimes we feel constrained in this area. Kevin, do you want to come in and say anything else, or do you want me to open it up? I maybe don't want to open up so much for comments, but what are your thoughts? Okay.
I appreciate where Dale's coming from, because his experience, as you've heard, many couples have come to him over the years and been helpful. I'm not on yet, am I? That's because I turned it on. Oh, no wonder. Got to be smarter than the mic.
Hey, can you hold up for just a second, because there's one thing I forgot to do.
No, I'm going to go ahead and go ahead.
Hold on. I'm going to borrow her Bible. I don't know why
I wondered why you pointed that out and then never used it.
The truth is, I didn't have a PowerPoint tonight, so that kind of keeps me a little more unstructured. So here's something I want everybody to do, and it's interesting. And I'm picking this not because it's Bible, because the collar of the Bible. I want everybody to stare at the collar of this Bible. Do you see the collar of this Bible? Stare at it. Just kind of get it embedded in your mind's eye. Do you see it? Just really stare at it, get in it, really get in your mind's eye. Now close your eyes. Now, whatever you do, don't think about the collar of this Bible. Absolutely don't think about it. Whatever you do, don't think about the collar of this Bible. Don't think about it. All right, open your eyes. For most of you, you thought about the collar of the Bible. And so what happens with many human problems, and it's really pronounced with things related to sex, is I'm going to think about, like the woman we were just talking about, I'm not going to think about what happened with that man back there, that young man. He was a jerk. I can't believe he did it. He should have been arrested. And the adults didn't handle it right. I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to think about my husband, because my husband has needs. You know how the mind works? Think about man not. I do hypnosis, not stage hypnosis, but clinical hypnosis, and that's part of what we do to, sometimes help people to go into trance. Is we'll say, and I'm not really going to do this. So like, whatever you do, you want to keep your eyes open, and you don't want to go into trance. You want to resist what I'm doing, and whatever you do, you can resist it. Did you see his face change a bit?
I did.
Yeah. So
You are
anyway,
now a kangaroo. I want to see
yeah,
your
no,
hobbies.
no, don't say that. I get in trouble for that kind of thing because I'm not allowed to do stage
That's not what he
hypnosis. I could
does.
lose my
No.
license for that. But it's the same principle. So we carry these things from our past, or we carry an argument from our past, or we carry something that happened. I talked to a man one time. He was 40 years old, and he was a virgin, and he was kind of really uncomfortable with women, and he stayed at this woman's house one night. It wasn't supposed to be sexual. He was just staying in town, and and so he was in this other room. She came in and performed oral sex with him in the middle of the night, and he ejaculated with like in 3 seconds, and and it took him another 15 years to get married after that, because all he thought about was, I'm no good. I can't do this because this happened. And that's what he was saying. And I said, man, you're good. You're made in the image of God. This happens first time. But it's like, no, I can't, and he tried not to think about it. The more he thought about it, tried not to think about it, the more he did. Now, look at the Bible again. You see the color, don't you? Look at it. You all see the color of the Bible? See it? Absorb it. See the color of the Bible. Close your eyes again. Now, this time, imagine the Bible is green. Imagine it as black. Imagine it as pink. Imagine it as polka dotted. Open your eyes. You could do all of those because we weren't doing the not thing. So part of, I think, us dealing with our histories, dealing with our constraints, things that haven't worked out, is instead of trying to push them away, is to think about how we can hold them differently. Yes, this happened, and I'm going to do this. Yes, this happened. I had this bad experience. It was painful. It was hurtful, and this is a different person. Or I had this bad experience with my husband and my wife, and we've talked it out. We're working on it, and it could be different. It's a small thing, but it helps us to move forward better than just trying to push it away. Kevin.
Yeah, I think it's powerful. You don't stop thinking something by saying, I'm not going to think it anymore. It's like telling you not to think about a purple pig. And if I told you don't think about a purple pig, in order to not think about a purple pig, first you have to think it and then say, that's what I'm not going to think about. Some of you have had trouble smoking, and you said, I'm not going to smoke anymore. Please, Lord, help me not smoke anymore. I don't need to smoke anymore. I want to put away the cigarettes. I don't want to smoke anymore. And the more you say, I don't want to do this, you first see it and then say, that's what I don't want to do. You prayed it once and you thought it twice. You're defeating your own prayers.
Yep.
And so it's the same thing with pornography. You say, I don't want to think about this anymore. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to. And you keep filling your mind with something. You say, I don't want to do this. And what you're going to end up doing. And by the way, this law of diminishing returns, some of you are trapped in pornography. You won't talk about it, but you are. And it's not magazines. It's the internet. It's open to you. It's constant. And there it is. And you say, man, I don't want to do this. But boy, this is appealing. And so what was at one time a gratifying sexual relationship, now you want more and more and more that the other is uncomfortable with. And men and women are both having difficulties today with pornography. And it's affecting the wiring of our minds even. I think you've got some literature on that. And it's just to try to stop something, what Dale's introducing is, what if I were to say, this is okay, and instead of I'm not going to, and I try to stop this, work on what you are going to do, the positive on that. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say? Is it resonating at all? Single people deal with this as much as married people. Married people deal with pornography as much as single people. Just a fact of life. Here's a guy that says, I don't want to be controlled by lust. I don't want to be controlled by lust. Every time I walk across campus, this is what I see. This is what I'm thinking. Every time I walk downtown, every time I come to church, wherever I am, this is what I'm thinking. And I heard an illustration. This couple had, in New York City of all places, they had big, green, yucky flies in their kitchen. And they were swatting around at the flies, and the more they swatted, it seemed like the more they multiplied. Until one day, the wife suggested, why don't we move the trash can out from underneath the window? See, they were swatting at flies while they were feeding their trash can. Many people are trying to stop behaviors while they're feeding the trash can. Get the garbage can out from underneath the window. Might be a possible solution. Stop feeding the thing that actually is destroying. And in many cases, in many relationships, pornography has not become a tool, as some psychologists would say. Just use it to explore and to develop it. I can see why that might be, for some people, a solution, but I don't think so. I think it feeds the heart of lust and creates expectations that are unreal. Are we designed for sex? Yeah, God designed our bodies for sex. For what purpose? There's a drive for intimacy. There's a drive for joy. There's a drive for pleasure. There's a drive to have children.
Yeah.
But that satisfaction, what we want, what kind of relationship do you want? Don't you want a healthy, growing, dynamic, deepening, mutually beneficial, mutually satisfying, loving relationship with other people and with the Lord? And how do you get there? I think some things is weeding out the garden so that the good stuff can grow. And there's some negative things in our world that are really at the root of destroying many relationships. And I'm just suggesting that needs to be investigated as well. You may have questions about that and how do you overcome or what do you do, and some ideas that would be helpful in that if you want. And maybe instead of you asking a question about yourself, you just have a friend who is dealing with this and you want to help that friend overcome something, all right? So has this opened up any questions, any ideas, any particular points of application? I know that this is, in many cases, an awkward point of discussion. But first of all, have you heard this kind of a frank discussion often in a church, family, and marriage seminar? Has it ever been addressed this way? Do you think it's helpful to address openly and honestly in today's world? Has this been a helpful thing? Can it restore? You said you weren't going to mention a book. I'll mention the book that you suggested to us years ago, and that was, and maybe it's the book you're saying it ends up with this joke, but it's sheet music.
Yeah, that's the one. That's a good book. I was going to recommend it, so I'm glad you did that.
Okay. Sheet
really
music
good
is a
book.
picture of a bed with the sheets on it and then musical
a pun.
notes on top. And the kind of music you have in the sheets, so you have sheet music, okay? So it's a play on words. It's a great pun.
Yeah.
But it's a very valuable book, and it follows up one of the books, but very popular back in the 60s and 70s was The Act of Marriage by Tim LaHaye.
Which was a good book, too. It was a good book,
both
too.
of those are very helpful.
I think the conversations, if I can say this, I hope that this isn't the only time that you're in a context where you have a frank conversation like this, and sometimes it's helpful to see somebody that's a Christian therapist that can help with these aspects of our relationship if we need to. Most of us are comfortable with it. I don't know if any of you watched the Falker series, Meet the Falker, and, Falkers and them. When my kids were young adults, I overheard one of them say to their new wife or husband, and I kind of won't tell you if it was one of the two boys or the girls, they said, "My dad reminds me of Gaylord Falker's mother." So I don't know I never knew if that was a compliment or not, but it's probably true. I'm pretty comfortable talking about this stuff because it's what I do, and I think, when it gets out to Boo Land and we talk about it openly, but do it within a biblical framework, it's appropriate. Any questions or comments or anything, or even disagreements? I mean, I'm happy that nobody walked out. A lot of times when I do this, people walk out, and nobody walked out this time.
Well, at least not physically.
Yeah. I'm kind of sensitive that I'd give something on artificial intelligence to the Alabama Association of Marriage and Family Therapy like 6 weeks ago. A colleague and I did, and we saw 8 college-age students walk out. And we thought, oh, this must be great because, they must be doing something, licensure preparation or something. And we found out at dinner that they told the organizers of the conference they were offended we were doing something AI related because of the ecological damage with it. So we were oblivious. They walked out on us, and they were taking an ecological stance, and we didn't even know. We just kind of happily went along. So nobody seemed to walk out. So I guess.
So what he's saying is, if you disagree with him, he wants to hear from you. That's a long way to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the AI thing is especially interesting today, and it's how we're going to adapt to that and what it's going to do in marriages and helpful, as well as destruction. I mean, it can be a tool for whatever. Who's first in asking a question or making a comment? Anybody? Okay, great. Who's next? You don't want to say anything because it's being recorded? Okay, I guess we
That
can turn
makes
that off.
sense.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a good time then to just
Conclude it.
conclude, and folks we'll hang around. Folks have things they want to say, they can. And
I'm going to suggest,
conclude it.
Bonnie wants to say something. Yeah. Hold on. Got to get a mic. What's that? Here we go. And then somebody else has?
Not
Yeah.
for me. I
No,
don't
keep
care.
going. You don't mind being recorded, right?
I don't care.
Okay.
No. I was just struck by the five.
Mike.
Oh, sorry. The 5 kinds of intimacy. That was helpful to me to break it down that way and to think about it. It enlarges it. It expands on the meaning, I think. Because I tend to, I've always heard of it in relationship to sexual intimacy, and it's much more.
it is.
And
it
much
is.
more powerful.
And I found it interesting what Dale said. I want you to do the non-sexual sexual intimacy. And the non-sexual sexual intimacy was talk with each other. It's a philosophy or intellectual. Do things that you found fun together. That's emotional. That's relational. That there's far more to sexual intimacy than vaginal sex. It is all of those together. Somebody used to say that great sex begins in the kitchen.
Yes,
And
yes.
sometimes is in the kitchen. So I just think, you're not confined to the bedroom.
Yeah, your sex organ's up here.
Yeah, it happens in the mind before it ever happens, and while it happens in the body, and it happens because of the mind. Absolutely. So this idea that intimacy, where there's only these kinds, we focus on each of those, they interplay with each other. And I believe that the 4 build a strong, that is the spiritual, the relational activity, the intellectual, and the emotional, all form together to help the physical become the fuller expression. And to ignore the others is to lose a lot of compatibility and connection and disclosure. The more open you are in all those areas of your life, the better I think your sexual relations are going to be. Does that make sense? I'm not asking that because I'm not sure that it makes sense. I'm asking that did I make sense in explaining that? Because I think that's real. Thank you for making that comment.
It's a good point.
Brad, you want to counterpoint here?
Well, since nobody seems to be willing to speak up, and since we're both over 80, why?
Yeah.
I will say, married in 1967. We were just sort of, now what do we do? Kind of, because there was no advice. I think maybe her mother had a 10 or 15 minute talk with her before the wedding, but it was all about sort of finding our own way. There wasn't even pornography to learn from, in 1967.
Well,
At least not that was available to us. So I appreciate what I think you're doing for some of the young couples here and some of the young yet-to-be marrieds. It's a good idea to wait, but once you're there, I think having the ability to find ways to pleasure each other that might not necessarily be what you expected is going to be very valuable, rather than over the course of 30 or 40 years sort of finding those things out by hit and miss.
Oh,
Kind of the
really?
way-
That was fun? Huh. Yeah,
Kind of the way we did.
sure.
And I don't really have any other advice, because you guys are the guys who know that.
I think about the era that you guys married. I was a kid at that time, but I remember the free love and the Woodstock and the make love, not war, and the openness and the nakedness that was developing around the country. And you had the hippies, and you had the big rock concerts where people started going wild. And it's just the time period and the anti-war along with all of that. And it was so much protest against anything. So part of the protest was, yeah, we're just going to have sex anytime. We don't care what society has said to now. And the experience then led to multiple partners that before marriage, and then, as you said, the shame. And in some cases where it wasn't, but it was pornography, there's still shame involved. And there's also that comparison in the mind. You think, man, I know what it was like in those minds, in my mind about all these different women. Now I'm with this one. And by the way, it was wrong for us to do it until the day of I do, you are. Mm-hmm. And now suddenly sex is okay for us. And you switch, you flip that switch, and suddenly it's okay. And my father-in-law even threw more water on this fire. He said, this is a great worship experience before the Lord. The thing I would suggest you do is pray together before your first sexual experience.
Wow.
You think that was helpful? It was. It really did add, because we had been building on the spiritual. And it was a helpful thing for us. And we did pray. And we took one night first to explore, and the next night second to consummate. And that was my also suggestion, I think Tim LaHaye had said. And he had some very practical advice about premature ejaculation, things like that I highly recommend the act of marriage because of that. It gives you some helpful tools. It might be or might not be helpful, but you'll find at least it stimulates the thinking of how to handle that. But those two books, both are being recommended tonight. The Act of Marriage and Sheet Music. Amazon carries both, so, and we don't get a bonus when you order.
I don't know.
Unless. No. Great comments. Anybody else? We're coming real close to the conclusion. Will you write down 2 or 3 things that you can talk about? Questions that you might address? Things like, before we married, this is what I expected. After we married, this is what... and I had one couple, the gal said, she first sought out some just training, and he then came and we would call it counseling, but I wasn't a counselor. She said, our wedding night, first thing that happened was, and at the end of it all, I said, is that all there is? Because he was satisfied, and she was wondering,
Yep.
what's happened here? Is that all there is? No real expectations, just some girl talk about how it was, because some girls had had sex, but she hadn't. Some guys had had sex, but he hadn't. He had a lot of pornography, and on their honeymoon, she found him reading or looking at pornography. And that really hurt the relationship, because when the gal knows her husband is into pornography, it attacks her image, and she feels threatened. Not all girls, but many. So that's the experience of some. Time for me to be quiet and you to talk, or us to finish. Write down 1 or 2 things that you can talk about with your spouse from anything that happened this evening, especially around this realm, and see what opens up. And you say, well, we've been married for years, and we've got this thing down. There may be some things that you heard tonight that maybe you could discuss, and you'll find, wow, that really has relit the fires of passion in our bedroom. You want to add to that?
No, I don't. I'd kind of like to just, if you don't mind, sit with this in silence for a few seconds, because we don't need to keep talking between me and you about this. I'm just going to invite people just to sit quietly for a few seconds and think about what we've talked about, not just these 2 hours, but through the whole day, would you just sit quietly for a few seconds and think about it? What's been meaningful and not meaningful, useful and not useful, and so forth. It's interesting to me that, at least I notice myself, sometimes when I'm up here and we talk about sex, that I don't always leave the space for people to talk and ask questions because I talk so much and I don't give that room. And I think with sex, a conversation about sex, leaving that room to think a little bit more is just very, very important. Okay, let's wrap it.
Consider this evening over.
It's
In the
been a long
words of
day.
Colonel Clink, dis